You know what I never understood for most of my farming life? Every single fall, I'd watch my neighbors spend hundreds of dollars buying hay. Truckload after truckload, stacked in the barn, getting moldy on the edges, and half of it wasted by spring. I did the same thing for years. You buy the hay, you store the hay, you feed the hay, and then come March, you're wondering where all your money went. Then I spent time around the Amish communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I noticed something that stopped me cold. These families weren't buying hay, not a single bale. Their animals were fat heading into winter. Their pastures looked better in April than most farms look in June. And when I finally got up the nerve to ask one of the older farmers about it, he looked at me like I'd asked him why he breathes air. He said, "Why would I pay for something the ground can grow for free?" That question sat with me for a long time, and what I learned after spending the next 2 seasons watching, asking, and taking notes in these communities completely changed how I think about feeding animals through the off-season. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly 7 cover crops that Amish families have been using for generations to replace purchased hay almost entirely. And stick around to the end because I'll share the reason modern agriculture quietly moved away from one of these crops, even though the science shows it outperforms commercial hay in nearly every nutritional category. I'll be honest with you, when I first heard the idea of replacing hay with cover crops, I was skeptical in the same way I used to be skeptical about everything that sounded too simple. I'd been feeding hay since my early 30s. That's just what you did in the fall and winter. But what I came to understand watching Amish farmers work is that I had been operating on a model designed by people who were selling me something. The hay industry, the seed catalog companies, the feed stores. They all benefit when you believe that growing your own winter feed is too complicated or too unreliable. The Amish don't think that way because they never had the luxury of thinking that way. Large families, limited cash, limited land. Every acre has to carry its weight. And these 7 crops are exactly how they make that happen. Before we get into the list, I want to share a principle that runs underneath everything the Amish do with their land. It's the same idea of stewardship that shapes their entire approach to farming. You are not the owner of this land. You are its caretaker. And a good caretaker doesn't buy what the land can already produce. That thinking leads directly to these crops, and it's why the results speak for themselves across generations. The first crop is hairy vetch, and I want to start here because this one surprised me more than any other. Most conventional farmers know hairy vetch as a cover crop for nitrogen fixation, and that part is true. A single season of hairy vetch can fix anywhere from 80 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre into your soil, which is the equivalent of a significant amount of commercial fertilizer, applied for free. But what most of us were never told is that hairy vetch is also one of the highest protein forage crops you can grow. We're talking 25 to 30% crude protein when cut at early bloom. That is higher than most premium alfalfa hay you can buy. Amish farmers in the older communities plant hairy vetch in late August through September. Right after their summer crops come out, it overwinters, comes back strong in spring, and the animals, horses especially, absolutely tear into it. I watched a man in Holmes County cut a stand of hairy vetch in May, and his horses walked right past the hay rack that morning without touching it. They knew which one was better. The reason you don't see this in mainstream agriculture is straightforward. Hairy vetch is hard to bale cleanly with commercial equipment because of its vining growth habit. It wraps around machinery, so feed companies moved the market toward alfalfa and orchard grass, which work better in industrial baling operations. The crop didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it couldn't be commodified the same way. The Amish never cared about that distinction. The second crop is crimson clover. Crimson clover is one of the most beautiful things you will ever see in a farm field, and it's also one of the most practical. The deep red blossoms draw pollinators like nothing else, which has benefits that ripple through your entire garden and orchard. But for feeding purposes, crimson clover produces dense, leafy growth that livestock find highly palatable, and that carries 20 to 25% crude protein at peak cutting time. What makes crimson clover particularly useful in the Amish system is its timing. You plant it in early fall, typically 6 to 8 weeks before your first frost, and it establishes a strong root system before going dormant. Come April, it explodes with growth that is ready for grazing or cutting weeks before your permanent pastures green up. That gap, those first 3 to 4 weeks of spring, when your pastures are still brown, is exactly when you're buying the most hay. Crimson clover fills that window precisely. The Amish plant it in combination with cereal rye for a mixed stand that provides both high protein from the legume and high energy from the grass. It's a complete animal feed growing right in your field. If you're in zones 5 through 7, plant no later than mid-September. If you're in zones 8 or 9, October planting works. The third crop is sorghum sudangrass. This is the summer answer to the winter question. Sorghum sudangrass is a warm season annual that grows with almost explosive speed once soil temperatures reach above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Under good conditions, it can put on an inch of height per day. A single cutting at the right stage gives you high-quality forage that cattle, goats, and sheep consume readily. And because it regrows after cutting, you can get 2 to 3 harvests from a single planting in one season. What I observed in Lancaster County is that Amish families use sorghum sudangrass as their summer hay replacement, cutting it and stacking it loose rather than baling it, which is a technique that goes back much further than modern hay production. The loose stack, built properly with good airflow, cures effectively and can carry animals through a significant portion of fall. By the time that stack is consumed, the overwintered crops are ready to take over. One important note here: you must let sorghum sudangrass reach at least 18 to 24 inches before grazing or cutting. Young growth under stress contains prussic acid, which is toxic to livestock. At the right stage, that concern is largely gone. But it's the one thing you need to watch. The Amish learn this the first time someone tells them, and then they never forget it. The fourth crop is cowpeas. If you have never grown cowpeas, you are missing one of the most reliable, drought-tolerant, high-performance forage crops that exists. In the old Amish communities of southern Indiana and in the Ohio settlements, cowpeas have been planted as both a garden, vegetable, and a livestock forage crop for generations. They grow fast in summer heat, fix nitrogen into the soil the same way clover does, and produce foliage that livestock find extraordinarily palatable. The nutritional profile is what makes this crop remarkable. Cowpea foliage at the right growth stage carries 18 to 22% crude protein. You can graze animals directly on a cowpea stand, or you can cut and dry the foliage as loose hay with minimal equipment. The stems are fine enough to cure without the heavy drying time that alfalfa or thick-stemmed clovers require. I've seen a clean-cut cowpea stand go from living plant to dried feed in 4 days in good July weather. The other thing cowpeas do is smother weeds completely. Their rapid canopy closes off the ground within 3 to 4 weeks of emergence, which means the field they're growing in arrives at fall planting time with almost no weed pressure. The Amish understand that every benefit a crop brings to the land compounds with every other benefit. Cowpeas don't just feed the animals, they feed the soil and clean the field at the same time. The fifth crop is turnips and forage brassicas. Here is where the story gets interesting, because this is the crop that most surprised people in the conventional farming world when researchers started looking at it seriously in the 1990s and early 2000s. Forage turnips and other brassicas like rape and kale produce an enormous amount of biomass per acre, often 4 to 6 tons of dry matter from a single planting, and livestock, especially sheep and cattle. Well, the sixth crop is winter rye. Cereal rye, not annual ryegrass, is the backbone of the Amish winter feeding system in the northern communities. It is the hardiest grain crop that exists in North American agriculture. It will germinate at soil temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It will grow through snow and resume growth in spring while the ground is still frozen in places. And it produces high-quality early spring forage that animals can graze directly or that can be cut and fed as green fodder before anything else is growing in your region. What makes cereal rye exceptional in this system is timing. You seed it in September or early October, and it establishes before winter. In spring, it's often the first field on the farm showing green growth, sometimes 3 to 4 weeks before perennial pastures. That early spring window is when hay purchases are highest, and cereal rye fills it completely. Grazing it in early spring, at the vegetative stage, when it's 6 to 10 inches tall, provides excellent nutrition. If you let it head out and cut it at late boot stage, the dried material makes a coarse but serviceable hay equivalent that carries high energy. Amish farmers also use cereal rye in combination with hairy vetch in a classic mix that provides both the protein of the legume and the bulk and energy of the grain. That combination has been grown in these communities for so long that when you ask about it, nobody thinks of it as a technique. It's just what you plant in fall. The wisdom is so old, it's invisible. The seventh crop is red clover. I saved red clover for the end because it represents something that I think is worth sitting with. Red clover was once the most widely grown forage legume in the entire eastern United States, before the industrialization of the hay and alfalfa market. Farms from Ohio to Pennsylvania to New England ran on red clover. It was the crop that kept horses working, cows milking, and sheep fattening through generations of American farming. Then the alfalfa market pushed it aside, because alfalfa yielded more tonnage in irrigated western conditions, and the seeds became cheap to mass produce. The commercial hay industry standardized around alfalfa, and red clover went from being grown on nearly every farm in the country to being treated like a niche specialty crop. Most gardening books today barely mention it. The Amish never stopped growing it. In Lancaster County and in Holmes County, Ohio, red clover fields are as common as any other crop. And when you look at the numbers, you understand why. Red clover is extraordinarily easy to establish, tolerates clay soils and wet conditions that kill alfalfa, fixes 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre into the ground, and produces forage with 15 to 20% crude protein that horses and cattle consume readily. It does all of this without irrigation, without synthetic fertility, and without the specialized seeding equipment that alfalfa requires. There is one honest note about red clover that the Amish will tell you directly. You need to be careful not to let bloat. Susceptible animals graze lush stands on wet mornings without prior exposure, because like all legumes, it can cause bloat. The management around this is simple: strip grazing, controlled access, introducing the crop gradually. But it's not something to ignore. Now, let me share some patterns I've noticed in how conventional farming approaches winter feed, and how the Amish system handles things differently. I made most of these mistakes myself, so this isn't criticism, it's just observation. The first pattern is treating hay as the default. Most of us never questioned whether purchasing hay was the only option. It's what our neighbors do, what the farm store assumes, what the system is built around. The Amish questioned that assumption because they had to. And the result is a feeding system that costs a fraction of the purchased hay model and actually improves the land it grows on. The second pattern is thinking of cover crops and forage crops as separate categories. In conventional farming, cover crops protect the soil and forage crops feed the animals. The Amish approach dissolves that distinction entirely. Every one of the 7 crops we've talked about does both jobs simultaneously. The hairy vetch fixes nitrogen and feeds the horse. The crimson clover protects the soil surface and feeds the cow. The rye holds the field through winter and feeds the sheep in spring. The boundary between land improvement and animal feeding doesn't exist in this system. The third pattern is underestimating how much a family farm can produce from a few well-managed acres. This is the one that took me the longest to shake. I had a mental model that serious forage production required serious acreage, but watching a family in Lancaster County feed a team of horses, a small dairy herd, and a flock of sheep through winter from a combination of cover crops on roughly 8 managed acres permanently reset my sense of what's possible when the right crops are in the right rotation